Love Janessa is the true crime podcast from the BBC World Service and CBC Podcasts, investigating the murky world of online romance scams.
She was trying to get me to send her money.
Catch up with the whole series now. Search for Love Janessa wherever you found this podcast.
You win their hearts, you win their wallets.
Welcome to The Inquiry on the BBC World Service with me, Gary O'Donoghue. One question, 4 expert witnesses and an answer. It's not often that a US president flies directly into a foreign war zone, but such is America's decades-old commitment to Israel. That's precisely what Joe Biden did 10 days after Hamas crossed the border from Gaza, killing more than 1,400 Israelis and other foreign nationals and injuring thousands more.
I come to Israel with a single message. You're not alone.
President Biden followed a stream of other high-ranking US diplomats and defense officials, and many more were to arrive in Israel in the following days, a show of unequivocal solidarity. But this long-standing relationship with the world's most powerful country didn't stop Israel being attacked, and decades of diplomatic efforts led by the United States has still not succeeded in creating a two-state solution, an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel, 2 states for 2 peoples. In this week's edition of The Inquiry, we'll be asking, what can US diplomacy achieve in the Middle East?
Part 1. Crisis diplomacy or diplomacy in crisis?
So Biden, I think, decided to go for 3 reasons. The first was he wanted to do a very public embrace of Israel, to make it clear that this was a terror attack, that it was an event that shook the nation the way 9/11 shook the United States.
David Sanger writes on national security in the Middle East for the New York Times. He's been a close observer of US foreign policy through the decades.
I think the second reason that he went was that while he did that embrace, he wanted to reach around and whisper in Bibi Netanyahu's ear and say that he was already worried that the narrative was changing, that already large swaths of the world had moved on from this awful, unbelievably barbaric attack, and they had focused, understandably, on the awful conditions of the people of the Gaza, the Palestinians there, who could not get out.
That concern, says David Sanger, has led Joe Biden to urge Israel to stick within international law and to begin to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza from Egypt in the south. It was a message to encourage Israel to show restraint ahead of any potential ground incursion.
And he was trying to avoid layering one tragedy on another. And that's why you heard the center of gravity of his argument shift, and to begin to discuss at greater length the need to make sure that while Hamas was dismantled and never again could do something like this, that it had to be done in such a way that there was the most minimal effect on innocent civilians, including Palestinians, who do not support Hamas. And the big question that's been hovering over this since October 7th is, are those 2 goals reconcilable?
That's a question that remains unanswered. And with such a fluid situation on the ground, few would have the courage to predict whether both aims are achievable. Right now, as well as Israeli casualties, the Hamas-run health ministry says around 6,000 Palestinians have been killed since the 7th of October. But there is fear the conflict could spread beyond the borders of Israel and Gaza, which is why the US has sent aircraft carriers to the region and put some troops on notice to deploy, in the hope of deterring other regional actors from getting involved.
So they've sent 2 carrier groups, the Gerald R. Ford and the Dwight Eisenhower groups. They put those in the Eastern Mediterranean. They are positioned so that they could do counterfire if a second front opened up here from Lebanon with Iranian-backed Hezbollah militias firing into Israel. There is still a significant fear within the Biden administration and the U.S. military that Hezbollah is biding its time until the Israelis get bogged down in Gaza and then would open up the second front. In other words, when the Israelis were least positioned to be able to go deal with it.
Isolating Iran has been a key focus of US foreign policy in recent years, attracting much more attention than the Israel-Palestine question. Indeed, the desire to find a two-state solution has been in stalemate for years. Instead, other goals were being pursued, such as the normalization of relations between Israel and some of its Gulf neighbors, including the UAE and Bahrain, under the Abraham Accords, a key pillar of former President Trump's Middle East policy. And an even larger prize seemed within grasp.
Biden, of course, had this fixed dream that he was going to cut the deal in the next few months to get Saudi Arabia to recognize Israel, and that in return, Israel would make a series of policy decisions that would basically push it to a two-state solution.
But Joe Biden has also had to consider public opinion at home, where many people believe America should not be involved in these faraway wars. It was a case he made to the nation in a rare primetime address from the Oval Office.
What I found interesting about the Oval Office speech is that he toggled between the battle to keep Ukraine independent and the battle to defeat Hamas and preserve Israel as we know it. And he said that the Russians and Hamas have very different motivations. One's a state, one's a terror group. We can make a long list of the differences. But what they have in common is that they're both trying to destroy a democracy.
And that friction between the aims of democracies and autocracies has been a prominent theme of the Biden administration's diplomatic goals. And the president sees it as America's duty to lead the world on this front.
The question is, if you're a true superpower, can you do it all?
But Israel does hold a special place in the American consciousness. And while there are voices on the American political left which are increasingly less wedded to the relationship, the majority across party lines still strongly back Israel. So what underpins this long-standing special relationship?
Part 2. The United States and Israel. A special relationship.
There is something that's kind of cultural and religious among wide swaths of the American public that kind of lends itself to support for Israel.
That's Stephen Cook. He's a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, a prominent think tank. He traces US support for Israel right back to the colonization of America, where evangelical Protestants believed in the idea of a Jewish homeland. 3 years after the end of the Second World War, that became reality, when the UN decided that Jews should be granted a homeland within the geographical area known as Palestine. Although the move was strongly objected to by Arab states, the US President Harry Truman became the first foreign leader to formally recognize the newly created State of Israel in May 1948.
He was very clear that it was a matter of justice. He was deeply involved in refugee relief after World War II and had traveled to Europe and seen displaced persons, Jews who were survivors of the Holocaust. And so there was that issue. It was the question of justice for President Truman, as well as his religious background, where, once again, denominations of the Protestant Church in the United States are strongly supportive of Zionism.
At a time when the US was competing for global influence against the Soviet Union, Israel became a key regional ally for President Truman, a relationship which played out well at home too.
You had a growing Jewish community in the United States that was becoming increasingly prosperous in states with large numbers of electoral votes. And there was a lot of pressure that was applied to President Truman in the recognition of Israel in 1948. So I think it was a combination of those factors.
But President Truman did face opposition from some of his own advisers, who wanted a more balanced approach to the country's diplomatic strategy. So Truman, and after him President Eisenhower, trod a fine line, trying to balance relations in the region between Israel and Soviet-backed Arab states such as Egypt and Syria, countries which refused to recognize Israel's existence.
Once President Truman recognized Israel, he kept the country basically at arm's length. There were loans that the United States extended to Israel that were expected to be repaid. Then President Eisenhower and his advisors really were seized with these early Cold War concerns. And while recognizing Israel and continuing to provide Israel with economic loans, really did lean in the direction of the Arab world. During those early years, Israel received the bulk of its security assistance from the French, some of it from the UK. So the contours of the modern relationship between the United States and Israel really didn't start taking shape until the Kennedy administration.
But if the security ties between the US and Israel weren't close during Israel's first decade of existence, cultural ties were, with America's increasingly prosperous Jewish community funding, among other things, cultural exchanges. It was the election of President John F. Kennedy in 1960 which brought the political relationship between Israel and the United States back to the fore. In fact, it was JFK who first used the phrase special relationship to describe the bond between the two countries. And he saw closer security relations with Israel as a way of keeping an eye on Tel Aviv's growing ambition to develop nuclear weapons, which it was pursuing with the help of the French.
The Israelis finally got what they wanted, which was a security relationship with the United States.
President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and even though America was getting deeper into its long war in Vietnam, JFK's policy on Israel was to be developed even further.
His successor, Lyndon Johnson, upon meeting the Israeli prime minister, said that they now had an even better friend in the White House.
It all came at the right time for Israel. In 1967, it fought a six-day war with three of its Arab neighbours, Syria, Egypt and Jordan, winning a convincing victory on the battlefield. Not only that, but it annexed East Jerusalem with its holy sites, sacred to Jews, Muslims and Christians alike, and occupied the West Bank territory, until then part of Jordan. It also ejected Egypt from the Gaza Strip, bringing many hundreds of thousands more Palestinians under Israel's control.
There was a recognition that Israel had, certainly in the cases with Egypt and Syria, had made quick work on the battlefield of two Soviet clients, and that it could be useful.
The 1967 war cemented Israel's close security relationship with the US. It also reinvigorated Palestinian nationalism, fueled by resentment that saw Israel as occupiers. This marked the start of decades of diplomatic wrangling and deadly violence, and one of the world's longest continuing conflicts.
The Explanation is the podcast from the BBC World Service that goes beyond the spin, exploring the important questions about long-running stories and the latest global news. An honest explanation of the events shaping our lives. Search for The Explanation wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Part 3. The Search for Peace.
So there were a number of Arab-Israeli wars over the decades, but the 67 war and then particularly the 73 war, those are some of the most important in determining the future trajectory of the region.
Emma Ashford is a senior fellow at the Stimson Center, a foreign policy think tank in Washington.
During particularly the 73 war, Kissinger engaged in really aggressive shuttle diplomacy, so flying between all the capitals of the region, Arab, Israeli, and trying to find some sort of solution. And he actually did succeed in brokering a ceasefire.
And that shuttle diplomacy, the phrase itself dates from the time, signalled the beginning of America's role as diplomatic leader in the Middle East, trying to negotiate peace in the region, even if its policies had appeared to favour Israel.
The US sent weapons to Israel. The US was willing to tolerate the Arab oil embargo in order to support Israel. And this marks, I think, a step where the US starts to take a slightly more balanced approach to the region, trying to mediate between the Israelis and the Arab states, rather than necessarily worrying quite as much about the Arab capitals.
While the 1973 Arab-Israeli war was brought to an end, it did nothing to change things on the ground for Palestinians. But 5 years later, America's diplomatic efforts during the conflict did bear fruit in the Camp David Accords, agreements brokered by President Jimmy Carter, which saw Egypt get back the Sinai Desert in return for becoming the first Arab country to recognize Israel.
This was at a period where Israel's very existence as a state in the Middle East was still questioned openly by most Arab leaders. And so the fact that Egypt, in exchange for peace negotiations, in exchange for concessions on the Palestinian question, for getting back some of its territory, was willing to actually recognize Israel as a state, that was a significant step forward in terms of regional dynamics and regional politics.
But with the fall of the Shah of Iran in 1979, the dynamics of the region changed once again. The US no longer had an ally in Tehran, as Iran became an Islamic theocracy.
After the Iranian Revolution, we do see the emergence of these groups, particularly Hezbollah in Lebanon, and that becomes something akin to not just a concern about Israel for the United States, but also a concern about terrorism, which then later on feeds into sort of war on terror concerns.
The 1980s were another bloody decade in the Middle East. Israel and the US became militarily involved in Lebanon. First Palestinian intifada or uprising against Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza took place, and Iran and Iraq fought an 8-year war. There seemed little chance of progress on a two-state solution until the early 90s, when a breakthrough seemed possible with the US-brokered Oslo Accords, new agreements signed by Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization at the White House.
But neither side was quite willing to actually follow through with these concessions. And I think it is fair to say that there is blame on both sides for those accords falling apart.
And since the failure of the Oslo Accords, the US hasn't really made any progress on implementing a solution to what is now a 75-year-long problem, says Emma Ashford.
Facts on the ground have just made this problem increasingly intractable. And so administrations have sort of worked around the edges on small issues, but I would not say there's been any concerted effort to initiate a peace process since about the Clinton administration.
And the long-hoped-for two-state solution seems further away than ever before.
Many regional experts at this point would argue that a two-state solution isn't really viable anymore. There are too many obstacles to doing it. And so there's no good political solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. US policy in recent years was simply to try and work around it. And I think what we found out is that we can't do that.
Part 4. Future Diplomacy.
De-escalating the current terrifying situation seems hard enough. Trying to imagine a more peaceful future in the region is an ambition few can envisage right now. Germany, France, Britain and others are all heavily involved diplomatically. But is the US still the only power that can make a real difference in the Middle East?
I think it has unrivaled diplomatic influence compared to other powers in the world, but it's not what it used to be in previous eras. And that's mostly because of the shifting power dynamics within the region.
Brian Katulis is Vice President of Policy at the Middle East Institute, which provides analysis on the region.
It's not only that Israel has grown much more stronger over the past few years economically and militarily, and that there's an imbalance between Israel and the Palestinians that has only grown. You also have a dynamic where a number of countries within the region, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, they've become all the more assertive in trying to advance their own interests in their own ways.
That new assertiveness complicates America's ability to flex its diplomatic muscle. Ironically, though, it's China's role in brokering talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran that has forced the Biden administration to re-engage.
The fact that China was stepping up its diplomatic engagement to complement its economic engagement in the region and technological engagement, that was the wake-up call for many in the Biden White House. And I think the main reaction inside of the Biden administration was to step up U.S. diplomatic engagement in the Middle East.
Stepping up that engagement meant building on the Abraham Accords signed during the Trump administration that saw the normalization of diplomatic relations between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain and Morocco. President Biden sought to build on that work, developing a similar deal between Israel and one of the region's major powers, Saudi Arabia. That proposal, says Brian Katulis, will have to be shelved for now, as diplomatic efforts will have to turn to talking to Arab states about the new conflict in Israel and Gaza, and on deterring Iran and its proxy forces from becoming involved.
As the conflict unfolds and moves into different stages, as Israel moves forward in its actions, it's going to provoke reactions within each of these Arab countries at a popular level. And it's going to require a posture and an operations tempo by the United States, by the Biden administration, that on the Middle East that it really was not prepared to engage in until this crisis happened.
Brian Katulis says that posture will also have to include a much greater focus on bringing the Israel-Palestine question into the centre of any discussions, a place it's not really occupied for more than 2 decades.
In all of the other deals, none of them really fully addressed the Palestinian question, and none really were constructed in a way that took into account how essential that piece in the puzzle is. And I think if there's any potential silver lining in all of this awful conflict and the loss of human life and civilians on both sides, it serves as a wake-up call, I think, to remind leaders in the region that were thinking perhaps that they could have another normalization accord that didn't fully address those concerns of the Palestinians.
But that will not be easy, given the new assertiveness of many Arab states on the international stage, not to mention the shift to the right in Israeli politics. We began the programme by asking what US diplomacy could achieve in the Middle East. And we've heard from our experts that, over the years, there have been some high points: Camp David, Oslo, the Abraham Accords. But we've also heard that those achievements were never fully realised, and usually followed by another cycle of violence. With a hot war in progress, little can be done diplomatically by the US right now, other than to try to minimise human suffering and prevent escalation. But a time will come when longer-term thinking will have to take place in the context of a new, more complicated international order. Multiple voices, not just American ones, will seek to bring their influence to bear. They will all face the daunting challenge of ending the human and political turmoil that's dogged the Middle East for 3/4 of a century. This week's edition of The Inquiry was presented by me, Gary O'Donoghue, and produced by Louise Clark. The researcher was Matt Tolson. The editors are Tara McDermott and Richard Fenton Smith. The technical producer was Kelly Young.